Welcome. I'm Phil Cubetta. I'm here today with Patricia Angus, Esquire, and we're going to talk about family governance, which is a topic on which she's a noted expert. Patricia, the topic is family governance, those two words. At the beginning of your article, you talk about what counts as family. Why is it so important to define family when it seems so obvious?
Sure. Boy, do I wish it were obvious. And I have to remind people all the time that it's not as obvious as we might think. There's several reasons, actually, and it's something that I keep refining my views on it and my questions on it, but I always have to ask whatever family I'm working with, what is family to them? So first, families today are very different from what they looked like 20, 30, 50 years ago. Back then we had Leave It to Beaver, now we've got Modern Family. I think it's a great example. If you think of Modern Family, it reflects a lot of the families that I work with. So the nuclear family, father, mother, 2.5 children, just is not as common as it used to be. So you might have families that include partners who are not married but are living together for a long period of time. You might include non-family members who are really as close as family to the people that you're working with. And in some of the families that I've worked with that have multiple generations involved, some of their friends, their advisors, their sort of trusted people outside are sort of family to them. So you really have to recognize that each family has its own way of defining it. Number two, the law is changing in every state in the United States, and it's also all around the world. We're focusing on things like, how do you define marriage? How do you define what kind of relationship gives you legal rights and responsibilities? We cannot ignore that. We would ignore it at our peril. So we have to understand what's the legal environment that we're working in. Third, I'd say that families, in fact, and my students really enjoy hearing this, families were ahead of the law on this because families have always had to define who their members are, whether it's in trusts that were set up 100 years ago or trusts that were set up yesterday, wills, even power of attorney. You're always having an opportunity to define who is family to you. So you need to, when you enter an engagement, find out what the definition of family is that already exists. And finally, that definition might be different for every purpose. So you may have your foundation board considers family in one way versus the business is different.
And the other word, governance?
Yeah, I love that word, and it's not well understood in our culture, which makes it very difficult. I had to go back to the dictionary because it gets very confusing after a while when you hear governance used. Frankly, I think it's used for family dynamics more than it's used for the actual meaning of its word in our field. So to govern really means to guide or to steer. So if you think about it, everyone in a group has some form of governance one way or another, and thinking about who's guiding it, who's steering it, how's that done is really critical. Another quote that I love to use, and it's in the article, is that law is regulating human behavior with language. And when we, for example, make a planned gift to an organization, or when we write a trust, write even a will that has very simple dispositive terms, you are in a sense regulating what happens in people's lives through your own hand. So you really have to think about that governing and legal mindset.
What do you consider to be the scope of family governance work? What is inside it and what's outside it? What does it govern?
What does it govern? I think I once said that there are some things you can govern, like who's going to love whom, and there are other things that you can't govern that, and people like to do that. There's lots of the old controlling from the grave trusts and wills that I've seen in the past, basically defining how people had to live their lives. You shouldn't be governing that, but there are other things that you are already governing, and so that is, what are the terms of your gift? What are the terms of your of the legacy that you're leaving, sort of certainly the financial and the tangible assets. You can sort of govern that. Governance is such a big word that people think it only applies, and I know that you're thinking probably that governance is really only going to apply to large governments and to large families, but I actually find that it applies to pretty much every small unit of a family.
So if a family starts out, let's say they have a business, restaurant or farm, whatever it might be. And by the time the planning is done, they have a foundation, they've got a CRT, they've got grits and grats, and all the things people do to make the tax numbers move around. So the before picture is mom and dad on the business, and the after picture is a lot of people have bits and pieces of different things. Is family governance, is the natural providence of family governance that after picture, when you look at all those flow charts and say there ought to be some coherence of how these things are managed to a purpose, or is that not the case?
Yes and no. Yes, that situation requires it, but I would say even in the prior situation, and I have noticed many people that think that just because they have a company, it's anything they can do with it. But in fact, that company probably has articles of incorporation, probably has bylaws. They probably already have legal rights and responsibilities behind that, even if it is just a, quote unquote, mom and pop shop. But no, people have to govern pretty much everything.
Okay. Well, thank you. That clarifies it for me. In your article, you say there are 3 stages. I think of the 3 C's.
Yeah, sure.
What are the 3 C's families go through in becoming a multi-generational successful family?
Sure.
I should probably not use that without asking you how you define that, but still, I mean, what are the 3 C's?
What have I observed? And this was really from the observations of families that I'd worked with and talking to other professionals in the field. And while we may think that things look really orderly, the chaos phase is where most people are, actually. So chaos is the first. Coordination is when you really start to pull things together in a more organized fashion. And at the end of it, I called it cohesion, but I would actually today call it continuity. That's where families really have a longer term sort of.
If you're thinking about the chaos phase, and maybe it's not obvious, maybe it's not tumultuous, but what are some of the hallmarks of a family in a state of chaos?
Right. In some ways it might be because it looks calm. Usually you have what I call the sleep at night work has been done, so that at least you have a will, you probably have created some sort of trust, you have your advisors, you have your lawyer, you have your accountant, you have maybe your financial planner, but they don't know each other, they haven't worked with each other yet, you haven't pulled them together. You probably have not yet discussed with perhaps your spouse or your children or anybody else who's affected by your plans what your intentions are, what you've actually already created. So it might be a very calm phase. I mean, I think it's sort of enjoyable to be there, but it's not always safe to stay there for too long, I would say.
And then the next stage is coordination.
Right.
How does somebody move from one to the other, or what would trigger that?
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, it's usually a crisis. So somebody is going to sell the family business. They sell it, and then the family goes into, some people have even called it a traumatic event that could freeze them for years. So for example, the CEO who doesn't have a plan for what they're going to do in the rest of their lives, there's that 18-month period where if they don't have something else to go on to, they'll come back and sort of try and recreate what they had already created. So there's the crisis that could be a positive, like selling the business. It could be a negative, somebody unexpectedly dies. The more thoughtful families have done their work before, and they say, we have all of these things in different places, let's pull it together. And that's why I call it coordination, because you really start coming together, and that's when you have your first organized family meeting, where you really have an agenda, people have input, you have a rotating way of, sort of including people with different points of view. And you start to talk about your mission, your vision as a family, I think, but it's really more of the pieces are getting sewn together better.
And then the third phase sounds like the nirvana phase of cohesion and continuity. What percentage of families get there, and how do you tell if they are?
Sure, I would say maybe 2 to 5% get there. I can tell if they're there if, say I'm interviewing a family before a family meeting, and they all have a common sense of their purpose, and they understand the difference between what they're doing together and what they can do separately. So they've sorted that one out. They've got much better communication skills among each other because they've spent some time grappling it out. They've had some time to figure out what their roles and responsibilities are and who are the best people to serve them. So it's not necessarily whoever shows up with time, because they may not necessarily have the skill. I've unfortunately seen people who end up having to do a lot of the accounting work for a family, a lot of the bookkeeping, a lot of the administrative work, and they really might not have those skills. It might not be their greatest use for the family. So they've sorted that out and respectfully divided up who does what, I would say.
As you're working with these families, helping them go through these stages, it seems like you're guided by the 3 Ps, the pyramid. And could you kind of walk us through what that is and how it works? And how
well, it's obvious why I chose the 3 Ps. The first P at the top, principles. I found that a lot of people, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, were actually making progress on the vision and the mission side. And so thanks to people like Stephen Covey and others in the field, Jay Hughes, who really raised people's awareness that they really need to have a sense of a vision and a mission. They would get together and they would have an exercise and they would create a statement, and miraculously some of them would do it in an hour, some of them would do it in a year. I'm not sure it can be done in an hour, and I'm not sure whether a year is tolerable to most people. But basically what I found was they would have this great mission, but it wouldn't be tied into anything they did. And so not only did I use the word principles because I think it's beyond just values, it's beyond vision, it's beyond mission. You go from principles, but then how are you going to make it happen? I mean, thinking as a former non-practicing lawyer, I spent a lot of time thinking about governance around the world and what works, and you have to have something larger than yourself to really accomplish things together and to accomplish things across generations, which is what we're talking about. So the principles, the policies are something as simple as who's allowed to be on the foundation board. And how does that tie into our overall vision for what we want the family to be? I've worked with families who say, yes, we're very inclusive, we want our spouses involved in everything. And then you would read their foundation documents and it would say bloodline only. Or their trusts would specifically exclude certain branches of the family, and it wasn't what they had intended. Sometimes just reading it helps them test their values. In the middle, it would be trust distribution guidelines, it would be gift parameters, it would be who can work in the family business, who can't, but tying that into the loftier goal I think is really important. The practices, frankly, is where most people get paid. So you do the estate plans, you set up a communication system, maybe you do a family website, you'd work on the security, you work on cyber risks, all of that kind of stuff. That's where we spend most of our time, but that has to then be tied in as well.
Okay. In your article you talk about all of this requiring a certain kind of environment to be done successfully.
Sure.
What kind of environment works and what kind of environment doesn't?
Right. I love theory, but I also think practicality matters. And so again, I sat back and reflected on what I thought were healthy families and families I saw struggling. And what I found, and from all the literature that I read on it, the families that really seem to work together in a pretty good way. And I think we have to be realistic about what our goals are. We're not looking for a well-oiled machine. We're looking for people who have complicated lives that they need to work together on. So what do I think works well? Open communication, transparency. This means that if you are intending to make certain decisions, for example, in your will, make certain decisions on your philanthropy, that you've communicated that to your family. I find that if somebody comes to me and they want to hire me and they say, this is great, I've got all these trusts and don't you dare tell anybody about it. I find that I'm not really the right person for them because their goal might be to help their family, but the way they're going about it is not necessarily going to get them there. So they have to be willing to open up their communication with the family. They have to be willing to have some transparency. I'd also say that the balance between the individual needs and the group needs is really important, and that basically comes from family systems theory, which looks at the family as an ecosystem, so that what affects one person affects another, and you have to have sort of almost a balance or a stasis among them. So one example that I've used with families that is quite productive, and they have to be interested in this, is if you are giving a certain sum together, and it could be any amount, you take part of that pool and everybody agrees on something for that. And you focus on the mission, not on each person's, pet interests or personalities, frankly, and you do something in common with that. And then you take small portions and you divide it up among people so they have some autonomy. If you if you tie them too tightly together, they're just going to want to get out.
Well, thank you. This has been extremely helpful. Thank you.
Good.
You know, so much experience in so few words.
Well,
Thank you.